Ever find yourself, stuck making a choice, trying to figure out what feels right versus what might actually work out best for everyone?
Yeah, it's that classic tension, isn't it, between your own moral compass and the bigger picture consequences.
Exactly. And that's right where John Stuart Mill lived, philosophically
Hmm.
speaking. He's the focus for our deep dive today.
Absolutely. A huge figure. And we got some great sources lined up to really get into his head.
We do. We're looking at analyses of his ethics, bits from his autobiography, his work on political economy.
His ideas on women's rights, representative government, plus a really solid overview from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So, a good mix.
Yeah, quite the range. And our mission today really is to unpack Mill's utilitarianism. What's at its core? What are its strengths?
And also, where are the potential, sticking points or contradictions? And what does it all mean for how we think about things like individual rights, society, government, all that big stuff?
Okay, let's jump in then. Utilitarianism. Give us the quick version.
Okay, so simplest terms. It's an ethical theory focused on results, consequences.
Right, a consequentialist theory.
Exactly. It judges actions by their outcomes. The main goal, as one source puts it, is striving for the greatest good for the greatest number.
The most happiness, basically, for the most people involved.
That's the core idea.
Yeah.
Mill himself, in utilitarianism, flat out says happiness is the sole end of human action.
Which sounds,
Right?
well, maybe a bit simple. I could see how that might stir things up.
Oh, it definitely did. People hear happiness and think, just basic pleasure seeking.
Yeah, just chasing momentary feelings.
Right. But Mill pushed back on that. He argued that, look, if people really think about what makes them happy, freely consider it, they naturally desire things that are genuinely fulfilling.
Hmm.
He even suggested that maybe for folks who haven't dived deep into other ethics, utilitarianism is almost like a default setting. It's natural to want happiness for yourself and others. And for you, our listener, wanting to get a good grasp quickly, Mill aimed to provide exactly that kind of foundational principle for ethical thinking.
That makes sense. But then he throws in this curveball, doesn't he? With higher versus lower pleasures.
Right, yes. That's crucial. It suggests not all happiness is, equal.
Yeah, tell us about that. How did that differ from, say, Bentham?
Right. Jeremy Bentham, another major utilitarian, they both agreed pleasure is the goal, the ultimate good. But Mill had what the Stanford Encyclopedia calls perfectionist intuition.
Perfectionist intuitions, meaning?
Meaning he believed certain pleasures, specifically intellectual ones, like learning, creativity, art appreciation, are just better, higher quality, more valuable than purely physical, sensual pleasures.
So reading a complex book brings a better happiness than eating a tasty snack, in Mill's view.
That's the gist, yeah. He felt anyone who'd truly experienced both would always choose the higher kind. They'd recognize its deeper, more lasting value. Now, does that distinction mean he's not strictly a hedonistic utilitarian like Bentham? That's actually debated by scholars.
Ah, right. Because he's judging the type of pleasure, not just the amount.
Exactly. But, as the Stanford article notes, the core is still similar. Pleasure, as the psychological basis of value, and the overall structure of their theories have a lot in common.
Okay, so pleasure is still foundational, but with this crucial quality dimension added by Mill, that feels like a key insight, an aha moment for understanding him better.
Definitely. But this focus on higher pleasures, on human dignity, it leads us to another really fascinating point, maybe a tension, that Arla Chill's article highlights.
Oh, what's that?
Well, Arja questions whether Mill sometimes seems to prioritize certain moral rules, like the importance of virtue, over the greatest happiness principle itself.
Wait, hang on. So he might say doing X would create more overall happiness right now, but it violates a rule about being virtuous, so we shouldn't do it.
That's basically the critique. It suggests Mill might have been reluctant to sacrifice certain virtues, even if doing so seemed like it would maximize happiness in a specific case.
Which, yeah, that does sound potentially contradictory if the ultimate goal is always the greatest happiness.
Right. If happiness is the sole end, shouldn't it always win out in a direct conflict?
This is where it gets really interesting for you listening. Even a giant like Mill might have these internal complexities, these difficult trade-offs baked into his own system. No easy answers.
Precisely. And that complexity, that tension, it really comes through when we look at how Mill understood rights.
Okay, right. How did he fit those in? Because that seems different from just calculating happiness.
It is, and it's another key difference from Bentham. The UC Berkeley source explains that Mill's idea of rights isn't just about what the law says. It's deeper, rooted in a moral understanding of human nature, linked back to those higher capacities we talked about.
So rights aren't just legal constructs, they have a sort of moral weight.
Exactly. Mill talks about a powerful feeling of justice that exists alongside utility. He believed in fundamental moral or human rights.
And justice wasn't just following the law for him.
No, because laws can be unjust, right? We all know that. For Mill, injustice happens when one of these fundamental rights gets violated.
So how did he identify these rights? How did he sort of ground them?
He used this really interesting thought experiment. He said, imagine you are the person whose right is being violated. Really feel that sense of being wronged.
Putting yourself in their shoes. Empathy?
Exactly. It connects to understanding multiple perspectives. Like you said, he wanted to base rights not on abstract theory alone, but on that shared human experience of injustice.
That's quite powerful. So his utilitarianism wasn't cold calculation. It had this built-in respect for the individual, for fairness.
Precisely. And this whole way of thinking wasn't just confined to ethics. Mill applied it much more broadly.
Right. You mentioned his other work.
Yeah, like in his Principles of Political Economy, those excerpts show him wrestling with real-world economic issues, production costs, money value, trade, taxes. He wasn't just an armchair philosopher.
And didn't he also work for the East India Company for a long time?
He did, yeah. Decades. That practical experience must have shaped his economic views.
And socially, he was quite radical for his time, too, wasn't he?
Hugely. The excerpts from The Subjection of Women, he was making incredibly strong arguments for gender equality, challenging the whole social order, demanding equal rights and opportunities for women.
Which really shows his principles in action, questioning basic assumptions. Something I think you, listening, can appreciate, that willingness to challenge the status quo based on deeper principles.
Absolutely. And then in representative government, we see him applying these ideas to politics, thinking about what makes good citizens good rulers.
And the dangers of the majority just running roughshod over minorities.
Exactly, what he called majority tyranny. He was focused on protecting individual liberty within a democratic system.
It really paints a picture of a very comprehensive thinker trying to build a coherent view of society.
Definitely. And you can see the seeds of it in his upbringing, described in his autobiography. That incredibly intense, rigorous education from childhood steeped in classics, logic. It clearly laid the groundwork.
Must have been quite something.
No doubt. It provided the tools for everything that came later.
Okay, so as we start to kind of wrap this up, what are the big takeaways? What should we really hold on to from this deep dive into Mill?
Well, first, I'd say, remember, his utilitarianism was nuanced. It wasn't just about simple pleasure-seeking. The quality of happiness mattered immensely to him. Intellectual, moral growth was key.
Right, not just quantity.
Second, he built justice and individual rights right into the system. They weren't afterthoughts. They were essential components linked to human dignity and overall well-being.
And we should also remember the tricky parts, right? The potential tensions, like between virtue and maximizing happiness in every single instance.
Exactly. It wasn't a perfect sealed system. Those ongoing debates are part of its richness. So for you listening, what's the bottom line? Maybe it's that thinking about consequences, the greatest good, is vital, but it might not be the only thing.
Yeah.
Factors like justice, individual rights, the kind of happiness produced, Mill forces us to consider those too. It's a more complex equation.
So here's maybe a final thought to chew on as we finish. Considering Mill's complex take happiness and rights intertwined, how do you balance those things in your own life? When you face choices affecting others, is there always one clear greatest good? And how do your own moral convictions, your sense of individual rights, play into that?
That's a tough one. No easy answers, and it's a question that echoes through ethical debates today. If we've piqued your interest, definitely check out Mill's own work. Utilitarianism, On Liberty, The Subjection of Women, they're really worth reading to form your own views.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into John Stuart Mill. Until next time, keep thinking.